Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan tonight. We are diving into a case against Karen Reed. She's accused of the murder of John O'Keefe in Massachusetts, a case that has taken on a life of its own. Take a look at the story. What happened on that frigid January night in 2022? The Commonwealth is laying out its case for what happened when Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found lifeless in the snow outside of 34 Fairview Road in Canton, Massachusetts. His tragic death has led to two controversial and emotionally charged murder trials, as his girlfriend, Karen Reed, once a finance professor, stands accused of second-degree murder. Prosecutors push back on any talk of a conspiracy against her, as the defense alleges, saying she struck O'Keefe with her SUV after a night out drinking and then left him to die. We look at the strength of the prosecution's do-over case as they attempt again to prove her guilt. The prosecution in this second case, they've streamlined things for sure. But it's still full of many things, many witnesses, lots of evidence. And what we're examining is the categories of these different witnesses and the evidence that they brought to the case. We're beginning with those who were at the scene that night, early in the morning, finding John O'Keefe's body in front of 34 Fairview. And the phrases that the prosecution alleged are tantamount to a confession. Here's testimony from Jen McCabe, a former friend of the defendant and a friend of the victims and first responders.
Did you hear or do you remember the defendant saying anything to the first responder?
Yes.
What did she say?
She told the first responder, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
When she told the first responder, I hit him, how did you react?
I was like startled, kind of like, what are you saying? What are you talking about?
And when you looked up and saw that person and asked about any background, what did she say to you?
I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
How clearly do you remember her words saying to you, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him?
I remember it very distinctly.
I asked if there had been any significant trauma that happened that preceded this, and she answered with a series of statements that she repeated. I hit him. I hit him.
Those words in court came in many different variations depending on who was speaking and whether this was the first trial or the second trial. Was it, I hit him? Was it, did I hit him? Was it, could I have hit him? We don't know. We haven't seen Karen Reed on the stand answering those questions. But the first question in our investigation is this: what do these scene witnesses add to the case in chief for this prosecution? Let's bring in our guest who's going to break this down for us, former prosecutor and host of It's a Crime with Margaret McLean. We have Margaret McLean with us. Margaret, thanks so much for joining. Tell me about how reliable you think this confession evidence, these alleged admissions are in front of a jury in the way that they were presented.
Well, first of all, these scene witnesses are the building blocks to Hank Brennan's case, and he's the prosecutor. And I think it's crucial that he started his entire case with Timothy Nuttall, who was one of the early EMTs to arrive on the scene. And he's credible, he's independent, and he states that he heard Karen Reed say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And then you had Katie McLaughlin, who was also another credible, independent witness, again, an EMT, who heard the same thing. I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And this is an admission by the defendant. And that's why I think Hank Brennan strategically had those witnesses come early on. And then, of course, after that, you have Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts on the scene, who corroborated these on-scene witnesses.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of corroboration. There were so many people, but are you surprised that none of this is on the record? None of this is in anyone's report. No one came to police with it initially. It's really in the months in the investigation that followed that we got all of this information about the many times that she said that term, reportedly.
Well, you're absolutely right. So originally, this was just a hit-and-run accident. When the first responders responded, they didn't realize this was going to end up to be the trial of the century here. So they typically don't make those types of reports. And of course, it came on later when these people like Timothy Nuttall and Carrie McLaughlin were interviewed by the police. So the reports came later, and of course, these people testified before the grand jury. They testified before jury, the last year's jury trial, and then again this year. And I believe, based on, I've heard them multiple times, and they seem to be quite consistent and quite credible as well. So, but the jury is only hearing this case for the first time. So, I do believe they were credible. They made eye contact with jurors. I mean, what reason would they really have to lie? Are they all part of a big conspiracy? I don't think so, especially the first responders.
And I'm glad you reminded us that this jury is hearing this for the first time, Margaret. I want to bring in or play a piece of evidence from another scene witness, Carrie Roberts. She took the stand. She was a close friend of John O'Keefe's, and she talked about finding him that early morning and what he looked like. Take a listen.
His body was completely covered, but his head was completely covered. So I started to dig around his face and his eyes, and his left eye was fine, but his right eye looked like it was huge. His legs were covered, his arms were by his side, he was on his back. Karen had lifted up his shirt, so now his shirt was down, but I was doing chest compressions so you could see his clothing. He had blood coming out of his nose and his mouth. And when I put the baby blankets under the back of him, there was blood on the blanket, so I think he had a cut on the back of his head.
Our guest, Margaret McLean, is still with us, and joining us now, criminal defense attorney Sydney Rushing. Sydney, let me ask you about these scene witnesses, including Carrie Roberts now. What do they add to the case for the prosecution?
Honestly, at this time, I think that they add a lot of confusion with their testimonies. Their testimonies, Jen McCabe's and Carrie's, they have actually contradictions between the two of them. Also, when it comes to the first responders that were on scene, they said that Karen said, I hit them, I hit them, I hit them. I do a lot of work in Wayne County, Michigan, which is, we have a ton of criminal defense work here. And I can tell you from the vast amount of police reports that I've seen and I've read, this is definitely a statement that 1,000% would have made it into a report. So I'm surprised that it's not there, that, once it was, twice it was said, then it was 3 times that it was said. So at this time, with both of their testimonies, I think it added a lot of confusion.
Confusion is what seems to have been going on at this scene, though. Let's listen to Jen McCabe. She was talking about what the defendant was like when she was on this scene and really kind of adding to perhaps what was chaotic about it. Take a listen.
Describe her demeanor.
Miss Reed's?
Yes.
Jen! Jen! And then she's screaming that John didn't come home. She left him at the waterfall. She was hysterical. It was very hard to follow what she was saying.
Margaret, this is an emotional time. These friends are finding their friend in the snow. Can that perhaps sometimes have a juror question their testimony when they know this was a pretty chaotic situation?
Well, I think it was very chaotic naturally, but I would say one thing I will add here is jurors will go into that deliberation room, and each juror will it's almost like they've watched different cases, like they'll come up with different observations. And I will have to say, I disagree in that I don't think there was that much confusion between Carrie Roberts' testimony and Jen McCabe's testimony. One thing I noticed that really struck me was both Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts, they both teared up when they were talking about finding John in the snow and the fact that he had no pulse, and they were trying to perform CPR, and then the ambulance came and the paramedics, and I felt that they were so emotional, yet I haven't seen any of that emotion from the defendant, Karen Reed, in any of her TV clips, or even as she's sitting there watching this trial.
Sydney, talk about these contradictions that you mentioned, because that is something about, especially these two friends, these two Massachusetts moms. They brought a lot of emotion, a lot of care as lay witnesses. Where did you find the contradictions that were the most glaring, in your opinion?
So I think first and foremost, when we need to talk about the I hit him thing and saying that that's an admission, I think that that's somebody who's finding themselves at a chaotic situation and even being told that this could have been a possibility and kind of taking that inward, right? But between Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts, Carrie said that she received a call from Karen at 5 in the morning on the dot, and that she said, oh my God, John's dead. And then she called back, and then they went through this whole thing and how she told Carrie, I guess, that she hadn't been to John's house. She hadn't checked it. So Carrie said, look, let's go check there first before we jump to conclusions, yada, yada, right? And then we have Jen McCabe, who testified that she received a call at 5:45 in the morning from John's niece, and she heard Karen going, crazy in the background. So when you have these two conflicting stories about when Jen McCabe and Karen, and when Carrie Roberts got to Karen, where they met at John's house, that's a huge contradiction, because that's two different stories about when these two parties came together. Was it after 5 a.m. and, Karen hadn't been to the house? Or was it 4:45 a.m. where the niece is calling Jen McCabe and she hears Karen in the background at John's house?
All these witnesses brought a lot different. Our guests are staying with us. We're going to keep the conversation going. We do have to take a break, but coming up, we'll move to the category of police witnesses. What did they add to the case? Stay with us.
Anything that caught your attention in this video?
Yes, the right rear taillight of the Lexus SUV is missing the red lens cover.
In 2024, Jenaé Robinson left for a first date, but never returned home.
I didn't know that God was going to take her from me this soon.
Her car was set on fire and her remains scattered across the county.
Now, Maxwell Anderson faces a jury charged with this gruesome murder.
He was looking for girls like Jenaé.
We're taking you inside the courtroom as a community searches for justice.
The Deadly First Date Murder Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings, 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
I didn't think I hit him, but could I have clipped him? Could I have tagged him in the knee and incapacitated him? He didn't look mortally wounded as far as I could see, or could I have done something that knocked him out?
Police witnesses in the case against Karen Read, they presented the possibility of landmines, potential landmines that could chip away at the Commonwealth's case. And everyone was looking to see if Trooper Michael Proctor, someone who was embattled and fired during the second trial, would be taking the stand. His text messages suggested a campaign against Karen Read at all costs. Instead, we heard from Massachusetts State Police Sergeant Yuri Buchanan. Here he is testifying about the damage to Karen Read's taillight.
Is that a fair and accurate depiction of what you saw?
Yes, it is.
From what you saw, was the damage you saw when you looked at the car for the first time in the Sallyport area any different than the damage that appears on this Exhibit 13?
It is not.
Did you view this photo?
Yes, I did.
Did you make any particular reference or anything that caught your attention in this video?
Yes, the right rear taillight of the Lexus SUV is missing the red lens cover, and it is damaged.
Here's what we're going to walk through in our next question in the investigation. What did these police witnesses add to the case? How did they help or did they hurt? Let's bring back in our guests who are standing by. Former prosecutor Margaret McLean and criminal defense attorney Sydney Rushing. We're going to walk through a lot of different topics, but let's start with the taillight and what the police saw when they took those pictures and what they believed about it. Margaret, I'll start with you.
Well, of course, they added quite a bit to the Commonwealth's case because the taillight is a key piece of evidence. And Sergeant Buchanan described it. He showed the pictures of it. He also showed how the pieces of taillight were collected at the scene. And of course, he had to deal with the ghost of Proctor, who is not going to be called in the Commonwealth's case. But I thought he handled it pretty well. He was on the stand for a number of days. And again, he is part of the police investigation and showed how methodical it was leading up to building those puzzle pieces for Hank Brennan and the Commonwealth.
Sydney, do you think it was a good move by the prosecution to call Buchanan instead of Proctor, even though Buchanan was on one of those text message chains that had some problems? He was docked for it, docked some PTO time. Talk about him on the stand and the credibility that you think the jury took from him.
So, that's a great point, is when it comes to his credibility, your testimony only goes as far as your credibility is going to take you. And I think he actually really hurt himself with his credibility. And when it comes to Michael Proctor, I know that they called Buchanan instead of him, but all the jury is hearing throughout this trial is, this lead investigator Proctor, the lead investigator Proctor. And if they don't call him as a witness, it looks bad on them. It looks like they're trying to, hide something or, pull aside the bad stuff. And the jury's going to make that connection. The defense is going to make sure the jury sees that connection, especially in their closing. You haven't heard anything from this lead investigator. Why is that? Along with the other issues that they have throughout this case. Buchanan, I think, was, he contradicted himself a little bit, but I think it really hurt him when he tried to say that Proctor was an honorable, investigator, and that he did this with, through all the right ways. And I think everyone knows that that is not the case.
Well, let's talk about another part of the investigation that could be very important to the prosecution's case that Buchanan was able to bring out. And this is about John O'Keefe and how hard they believe he was struck based on where they found certain items in the snow. Take a listen.
When you looked at Mr. O'Keefe's clothes, you said that you bagged them. Did anything stand out in particular about his set of clothing?
In particular, we were missing a sneaker of his. That was very significant to me.
Why was the missing sneaker significant to you at that point?
At that point, our theory had evolved to a vehicle strike based on the injuries, and I was suspecting that he was hit out of his shoes.
Margaret, let's talk about being hit out of shoes, or, as we know, the defense is alleging that it all happened inside of 34 Fairview, that he was beat up by fellow officers and then tossed outside. So that could explain shoes as well. But talk about, from your standpoint, maybe other cases that involve people losing their shoes after they've been hit by a car.
Yeah, it makes sense. If you're being struck by an 8,000-pound big SUV, you can be knocked right out of your shoes. And I've heard about it before in other cases. And also, I think Buchanan's testimony is further corroborated by what we heard today about the, from Dr. Welcher, who is the accident reconstructionist, explaining exactly how this accident happened, and if she's pushing down on that gas with almost 75% throttle, I mean, she is gunning it and hit. I do believe that John O'Keefe was hit and knocked right out of his shoes. Absolutely.
Sydney, these officers walked shoulder to shoulder. They did a grid search of this area, right by the flagpole, the fire hydrant, the area where John O'Keefe's body was found. But there were some things they didn't find on that first pass.
They didn't. And also, they used a leaf blower to blow some snow away. They used red Solo cups to pick up blood evidence. They used a stop and shop bag to carry these things. All things that would not be normal at an investigation scene. So I think that just goes to show the sloppiness of this investigation. And further, when it comes to getting hit out of your shoes, if a vehicle is going 24 miles per hour at a person and hits them hard enough to hit them out of their shoes, I'm expecting hip injuries. I'm expecting ribs to be broken arms, kneecap injuries. And the accident reconstructionist who testified today also said that those were injuries that he would have essentially seen as well. So when we look at this and, we take this all as a whole, Officer Buchanan also showed, and I think this is something that's been an issue this entire trial, is their evidence. When he pulled a shoe up that he supposedly recovered from the hospital, It was actually marked as the shoe that was found at the scene, but it wasn't. So how do these evidence bags get messed up when they should have been taken back from the first trial, resealed exactly how they are, and now they're marked differently? So I think that that's the issue that the Commonwealth is having throughout this entire case, is that evidence doesn't seem to be adding up.
So speaking of evidence, the physical evidence that they found, let's listen to another police officer who was on the stand, Canton Police Department Lieutenant Paul Gallagher. He's talking about the cocktail glass evidence, something that the prosecution says John O'Keefe was holding in his hand when he was hit.
You see the end of the leaf blower?
I do.
There's an object just below it at like 7 o'clock. Do you see that?
I do.
Did you discover something in that area?
We did.
What did you discover?
It's a cocktail glass.
There's that leaf blower you were talking about, Sydney. Margaret, let me go back to you, though. Is it a wash to have these police officer witnesses on the stand? I know you need them for a case. A jury would probably question it if they didn't testify, but there were some problems with this investigation.
Yeah, but, you know, I really don't have a problem with the leaf blower. And yes, of course, the blood should have been collected in, you know, some type of plastic container that had a lid on it. However, in the long run, we know this is John O'Keefe's blood. They're not trying to prove it wasn't John O'Keefe's blood. So I think that the defense is making a bigger deal out of it than it is. And don't forget, these were conditions, very snowy conditions. It was a blizzard. So I think they did the best they could with what they had. And I didn't think the leaf blower was that bad of an idea, to be honest.
Historic blizzard going on. Absolutely accurate, Margaret. Thank you for reminding us. Sydney and Margaret, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. When we come back on VPI, what did the data add to this case? Now. Welcome back to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan. A jury in Massachusetts has been listening closely to the Commonwealth's case against Karen Read. It's a highly anticipated retrial. Here's the story. It was a snowy January night in Canton, Massachusetts, when Boston police officer John O'Keefe's lifeless body was discovered, battered and bruised, with his eyes swollen shut, cuts on his arm, and blood beneath his head. He and his girlfriend, Karen Read, had been drinking the night before. Prosecutors alleged she dropped him off at 34 Fairview, a home belonging to fellow officer Brian Albert, but that O'Keefe never made it home. Investigators focused on Read's SUV and a broken taillight. They say the vehicle was the weapon and Read's recklessness was the motive, but she insists she's being framed, the victim of a cover-up. We evaluate the case the prosecution has made against her. You've heard the devil is in the details. Well, the details could be in the data in this case. When we look at the case against Karen Read and the data that's really being focused on inside of the courtroom, there are two devices that really come to light. It's either cell phones or the vehicles. And Ian Whiffen, a digital forensic examiner with Cellbrite, the company that downloads and extracts data from cell phones, he testified about John O'Keefe's cell phone data and what it said about his final moments, the steps that he took allegedly, and his final location.
Yes, around 12:31, 56 or 57 is the start of the health event, 36 steps.
How long? How many seconds does that phone move for?
20 seconds.
12:31:56 to 12:32:16?
Correct.
Okay. And is that the only time that the phone moves from the point it stops at the flagpole until the next morning?
Correct.
The only time?
Correct.
Steps have become a key buzzword in this case when it comes to the data and what was on the phone of the victim in this case, John O'Keefe. So that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What did the data add to this case? Did it help? Did it hurt? And who did it help the most? Let's bring in two of Massachusetts experts that we have on deck. Attorney and former prosecutor Catherine Loftus is with us, and trial attorney Wayne Dennison. Good to have you both on. Catherine, let me start with you. The steps used to show one thing or another by the prosecution, they say 34 steps were taken after a certain time period. So we're talking about around 12:30 in the morning, around the time that Karen Read would have left this area. The defense says that he went inside the house, but the prosecution says these 34 steps would have been around the time that he was hit. How do you break that down?
So that's really the difficult question. We have one sort of subsection of data that's being interpreted two different ways. From the Commonwealth's perspective, they believe that John O'Keefe's cell phone records reflect that at nearly exactly the time that Karen Read was backing up her Lexus, that his phone took a few more steps and that essentially didn't move from the spot in which it was found the next morning. Now, there was testimony from Ian Whiffen of Celebrite about the data point and sort of the circle around, so which is the area in which technically it could be in. Now, the defense is using that to argue that it did not, in fact, stop in the place where John O'Keefe was later found, that data shows that he did, in fact, go in the house. And that hasn't been explored quite as much through the prosecution's case in chief and the defense's cross-examination of the witnesses nearly as much as it was in trial number 2. So I expect that they'll expound upon that at some point in their case in chief. But we're really looking at, ultimately it comes down to different sets of experts who opine as to different really conclusions and which one the jury finds either more reliable or what they think lines up more with the evidence that's otherwise presented.
Yeah, Wayne, we already know that the defense has an expert who's going to say something pretty much different than what we heard from Ian Whiffen in terms of what this data shows, what that red circle is, what it includes and what it doesn't include. What stands out to you about the data in this case?
Well, so far the data in the case really does confirm the prosecution's theory in a way that ties up a lot of the loose ends that you saw in the first trial. The issue here ultimately will be a battle of experts, whether this expert, Ian Whiffen, and quite frankly, the expert who was on today, who was the accident reconstructionist, whether these two people are more persuasive than the defense experts. The defense has not gotten a great deal of traction thus far with its theories through the cross-examination of these experts with respect to the data. And quite frankly, some of the data testimony begins to become confusing, especially as you try to align the clock on the phone with the clock on the car. None of that really comes together clearly.
Oh, yeah, it's a lot of numbers in this case. I'm going to throw in another set of numbers because this was new information inside of the courtroom this time around in terms of trial number 2. And that's the data about the temperature of John O'Keefe's phone. Let's take a listen back to Ian Whiffen testifying about that.
By 37 minutes after midnight, we now know the device is already at Fairview. It's been at Fairview for approximately 12 minutes. And the temperature has continued to drop. It's now 72 Fahrenheit.
Mr. Whiffen, if I can interrupt you. At 12:37, when the temperature drops to 72 degrees, is that before or after the healthcare data stops for that evening?
That's after. At 1:36, it's dropped to 50. And then we have a large gap in the data, with the next record being made at 6 minutes after 6 a.m. when the temperature is 43 Fahrenheit.
Catherine, I've been involved in a lot of trials, a lot of cases, covered a lot of trials, and this is my first time seeing a temperature of a phone being used to determine perhaps time of death or where someone was when they passed away. Talk about the temperature and the use of that this time around compared to perhaps other cases.
So we didn't hear this at all in trial number 1, and this is the first trial, as you stated, that I think it really has come into play in such a significant way. What the Commonwealth is using the phone and the temperature to show is that not only does the data in the Lexus, the data from his phone and the steps, the Apple Health, show that he didn't go inside the house, but the physical phone does as well. And Ann Whiffen testified that as the night wore on after 12:32, that the temperature dropped, every hour, a little bit more. And I think the lowest temperature it eventually went to was a little bit less than 40 degrees. And what the Commonwealth wants the jury to take from that is there is no increase in temperature, that if you have your phone outside or if you leave it in the sun, it either goes up in temperature, it goes down in temperature. And that there would be no way to have that kind of temperature on a phone if the phone had, in fact, gone inside for any point in time. And so what they're doing is using these little pieces of data to try to tie them all together. It's not one big piece or one big bombshell, but there's small pieces that they can point to say, not only do we think that the Apple Health data shows he didn't go inside, but we think the phone battery temperature itself assists in that claim.
So Wayne, because this is the first time around, we don't really know what the defense's expert is going to say about this yet. But what do you think the defense is going to do in handling this temperature data, and your thoughts in general?
I think you're going to see a lot of emphasis on the gap that Mr. Whiffen decided to just elide over quickly. You're talking about a time gap, I think, of almost 5 hours between some of those recorded temperatures. I think you're going to see a lot made relative to that. The issue is, frankly, the prosecution is trying to build a case brick by brick, and this is another brick for them. And what the defense is going to try to do is take that brick back out of the wall. And I suspect that they're going to do so by talking about the gap in data.
Wayne, you mentioned another new witness and data that came from the vehicle. Let's listen to Dr. Judson Welcher talking about the injuries and whether or not they are consistent with a taillight.
Sir, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty about the lacerations on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm and forearm regarding its orientation relative to the broken taillight on the defendant's Lexus?
Yes, Your Honor, may I read my report, my opinion?
Okay.
The location and orientation of the laceration on John O'Keefe's right forearm and arm are consistent with the geometry and orientation of the right taillight of the Reed 2021 Lexus LX 570.
Catherine, Dr. Welcher on the stand. He had a lot of data in terms of the speed of the vehicle that he said was going 24 miles per hour in reverse and traveled 54 feet in reverse, or 53 feet rather, in order to hit and kill John O'Keefe. That's the prosecution's case. Your thoughts on his strength as a witness?
There was a lot of information there today. There was a lot of data, a lot of numbers, even for those who are familiar with the case. It's difficult to keep track of. And so the question really goes to how much of this does a jury retain and which pieces of information are they focusing on? He seemed to be overall a fairly credible witness. What the Commonwealth is trying to use Dr. Welcher and his analysis to show is that the data in which he interpreted lines up with Ann Whiffen's, and that when you have, what the Commonwealth's perspective is, when you have different sort of subsets of data that seem to all line up at exactly the same point, that they want you to believe that it's that much more likely that Karen Reed did in fact hit John O'Keefe. So it was interesting. There was a little bit of pushback towards the end of the day relative to what he could actually opine to, which will be discussed a little bit in length tomorrow. But overall, I thought he was helpful to the Commonwealth.
Wayne, what did you think about his testimony, and do you think that jurors are going to give more weight to data from the Lexus SUV or to these lay witnesses who said, I heard her say, I hit him, I hit him?
Well, I think the lay witnesses are going to have a lot of force in this case, but the data experts and Dr. Welcher in particular, what he does is really tie up one of the pieces in the case that the defense has long been trumpeting, and that's how do you explain some of the some of the injuries to John O'Keefe's body. And Dr. Welcher went through, and including the arm injuries that were highlighted by the defense in their opening statement. And Dr. Welcher went through this and made fairly clear testimony as to how the injuries could well have resulted, and quite frankly, in his view, likely resulted from the accident as the Commonwealth has presented it. So I think overall he's helped the case for the prosecution quite a lot, especially with respect to an explanation for the arm injuries.
And that's a big part of this case. We're going to keep this conversation going. We do have to squeeze in a break. Our guests are staying with us. Dr. Welcher, not the only new witness to be added to this case. Our question is, what are the other new witnesses impact the prosecution's case?
The only way he could get this kind of an injury was to fall backwards, hit the back of his head, and then the resulting, energy forces going into his brain and into his base of his skull.
A VPI special report.
The P. Diddy sex abuse scandal that has rocked Hollywood and the world of hip-hop.
The downfall of a music mogul.
Combs abused and exploited women and other people for years.
An all-new look at the evidence and the latest from inside the courtroom.
That was the moment when everything changed.
Vinnie Politan Investigates, a Diddy special report, June 4th on Court TV. Now.
We are here today because John O'Keefe was killed by the actions and conduct of that defendant, Karen Reed.
Welcome back to Vinnie Politan Investigates as we look into the murder retrial of Karen Reed. Now, a retrial means a review of the evidence and case for the prosecution as they go after a defendant again after a mistrial or some problem in the first trial. And this time around, the prosecution has a streamlined case that is expected to be much shorter than the first. And there's also a lot of new faces that we've seen take the stand there in Dedham, Massachusetts. One of those new faces, meteorologist Robert Gilman. He testified that the ground that John O'Keefe, the victim in this case, was found on top of was a certain temperature. And we also heard from a neurologist, neurosurgeon, Dr. Ezek Wolf, who testified something after that meteorologist that the prosecution hopes this jury takes with them as they think about what happened to John O'Keefe.
The ground was frozen, the soil was frozen, and the surface of the ground was frozen. And it would have made the ground impenetrable.
The only way he could get this kind of an injury was to fall backwards, hit the back of his head, and then the resulting, energy forces going into his brain and into his base of his skull. His injuries were very substantial, and it's more probable than not that at some point he quickly became unconscious and was unable to do functional activities.
So with these new witnesses, we had this new information in front of this jury who didn't know about the lack of this information in the first trial, but they're able to take it in a way that no doubt the prosecution hopes will bring about a different outcome. So that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What did these new witnesses actually add to the case? Let's bring back in our guests, still with us, attorneys Catherine Loftus and Wayne Dennison. Wayne, let me start with you. Let's start with the meteorologist, because this was perhaps an unexpected type of witness. We don't often see a meteorologist come into a courtroom just to talk about the temperature of the ground or of the environment at that time. What do you think was the takeaway for these jurors from this witness?
What the takeaway was intended to be is that the ground was very hard, such that if you hit your head on the ground, you could sustain very devastating injuries. And this is a second trial, and you get to both fix your mistakes and plug your holes. And in this instance, the prosecution has decided to put on a couple more witnesses to plug holes in their theories. And they're going to plug the hole both with the meteorologist, who then testifies about how firm the ground is, and then with the doctor who talks about the extent of the head injuries.
Catherine, did we need to bring in a meteorologist just to tell these jurors that the ground was hard? They're from Massachusetts. They have lived through blizzards. Is it overkill to bring in a meteorologist to state this, or could it have still just been dealt with the neurologist? We'll talk about him in a moment.
Yeah, I don't think it was harmful. So anything, as long as it doesn't, from the Commonwealth's perspective, what they're doing is presenting information that, if at least it's a bit helpful for the jury to understand. In trial number one, it was a little bit difficult to discern from the Commonwealth what exactly the theory was. We had Trooper Paul, who testified as to the alleged injuries and the specific manner in which they believed that the vehicle hit John O'Keefe, that he fell to the ground, but there wasn't a specific set of evidence or testimony from any witnesses about how those injuries actually occurred. And so I think the combination of Mr. Gilman, the meteorologist, talking about what the weather was like that day, how cold it was. Obviously, all of us who live here in Massachusetts understand. I think it's a common sense sort of assumption that the ground is frozen solid in January. But then when you had Dr. Wolf follow up that testimony, specifically, discussing that he believed this injury could only come from a fall directly, accelerating onto something as hard as frozen ground, sort of tied those pieces in together for the Commonwealth.
Yeah, Wayne, it's these two injuries, right? It's this blunt force trauma to the back of the head that the medical examiner found on John O'Keefe, but also the look of his eyes. Can you start with why the look of John O'Keefe's eyes really bolstered those who felt that this is a conspiracy, that Karen Read was framed, and that there's no way that these injuries came from a vehicle slamming into his body?
Well, he had significant bruising on the front of his head around his eyes, which are suggestive of the fact that he might have been in a fight rather than suffered an injury in a car accident. The Commonwealth has now tied that issue up reasonably well by suggesting, and quite frankly, having testimony that reflects that kind of injury is in fact consistent, and that kind of bruising is consistent with the head injury that he suffered to the back of his head.
Catherine, what's your opinion on how the Commonwealth has done this time around? They've streamlined their case. It's a lot less witnesses, and we've seen these new witnesses on top of some of the ones that we saw last year.
I think they've done a good job. ADA Lally, who tried the case the first time, there was a lot of criticism of him. And what happened that time around was that the prosecution really felt like they were focusing on defending themselves against the defense theory as much as they were trying to prove their own case. In this trial, Hank Brennan has made a number of strategic decisions. He's not calling nearly as many witnesses. He's not calling the third-party culprits that the defense wanted to point at and did point at in the first trial. Didn't call the lead investigator. So it's a very different trial. It's, as you said, it's much more streamlined. It's more technical. The data seems clearer. Whether the jury will make a different decision this time, that's to be seen. And we still have to hear from the defense, of course.
That is the big question. Catherine Loftus and Wayne Dennison, thank you for lending us your expertise this hour. We are going to say goodbye here on Vinnie Politan Investigates, but want to keep in mind that a prosecution can retry a person many times over if a case keeps ending in a mistrial. They can tweak and improve their case each time, and it seems a bit surprising that they can do that, even unfair, but the burden always rests with them. Karen Read doesn't have to prove herself innocent. No defendant does. It's on the government to be able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And it will be up to these jurors to determine if this time around the prosecution has succeeded in bringing in enough evidence to show that Karen Read, in fact, was the one who ran her vehicle into John O'Keefe and then left him to die in the snow. Thanks for being with us. I'm Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.